Hello, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable on Oceanic Asia. My name's Tim Bunnell. I'm currently director of the Asia Research Institute, or ARI, that has organized and is hosting this event. ARI was established at the National University of Singapore in 2001. And one of the ways in which we're marking the 20th anniversary this year is by holding a series of virtual roundtables. How that's working is that each of ARI's research clusters and programs is assembling a lineup of scholars to reflect on past, present, and future directions of research in the fields that they cover. Today is in fact the fourth roundtable in the anniversary series, and the second one organized by the Institute's highly active Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster, which is led by Naoko Shimazu. The previous roundtable that the Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster put together just last week, actually, also had a profound oceanic dimension to it, focused as it was on a recently released documentary film by Isaac Curlow on afterlives of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Aceh. The film, for those of you interested, is called Tsunami of New Dreams. And I mention that partly here because it's an excellent film on the ocean as a sustainer and taker of lives, but also because ARI's connection to that film provides an opening into long-standing institutional interest in non-terracentric histories and geographies. ARI's founding director, Tony Reed, of course, is an eminent historian whose interest in the sub-seabed tectonic aspects of Aceh's environmental history was galvanized by the 2004 tsunami while he was still here in Singapore. But if in the lead up to today's event, I was reminded by another former ARI colleague from that time, Jeff Wade, that he and Tony Reed were also involved in a major collaboration with Momoki Shiro and colleagues at the University of Osaka on offshore Asia, a collaboration that led to publication of a volume with that title, focused on maritime interactions before the steamship era. Oceanic historical geography work continued in subsequent phases of ARI's institutional history, including through the Muhammad Alagil Arabia-Asia program, chaired by Eng Seng Ho, that was established while Prasenjit Dwara was director. And I note that Prasenjit himself has very recently published a piece entitled Oceans as the Paradigm of History. So quite a bit has already been done on oceanic spatialities and temporalities at or through ARI at various points, but much, much more remains to be done. And I'm delighted that today's event has brought together such an exciting mix of scholars to deliberate, amongst other things, where next to channel these conversations and intellectual currents. So my thanks to Stefan Huebner, above all, for making the event happen. I should say that I and many others have enjoyed reading drafts of Stefan's own oceanic work in the Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster in recent months and years. Most recently, a piece, and I'm flagging it here, in the Journal of Global History on offshore oil and the Asian Anthropocene. My thanks also to Ian Miller from a distance at Harvard University, but a close friend of ARI, for moderating, and indeed to all six presenters in advance. Of course, I think it goes without saying, we would much rather have been able to bring you all physically to or back to Singapore for an event on this theme. We all know why that hasn't been possible, and more widely, ARI's 20th anniversary celebrations have been very difficult to plan and execute during the pandemic. So I should also express my thanks to Naoko Shimazu and her ARI 20 committee for their ongoing organizational flexibility and tenacity. Finally, but very importantly, on matters of appreciation, my thanks as ever to ARI's events team, in this case particularly Tae Minghua, for their all-important administrative and logistical efforts. And the very final thing I have to say is that I hope at least some of you tuning in from around the world will continue to engage with ARI on oceanic and other key themes during the Institute's next 2 decades. Thank you again, everyone. And Ian, I think it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm just delighted to be there. For those of you whom I have not met, my name is Ian Miller. I use the he series of pronouns, and I'm lucky enough to teach history at Harvard University, where I work on histories of climate, energy, and environment, as well as oceanic history. I'm delighted to welcome everyone here today for our roundtable, Oceanic Asia, Global History, Japanese Waters, and the Edges of Area Studies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel and to introduce today's speakers. We're here today to listen to an impressive group of scholars who underline the global nature of the questions we're asking in today's discussion, the impacts of oceanic history, and the diversification of a field that not too long ago was not central to what we do, and now is at the center of an ongoing oceanic turn across the humanities, social sciences, and within history, most certainly. We're joined by Professor David Howell, batting for the home team for Harvard University, Dr. Stefan Huebner, who of National University of Singapore, whom has really been the heart and soul of so much of this work, and indeed who instigated the broader set of projects of which this is a part. Professor Manako Ogawa of Ritsumeikan University in Japan, Professor Sujit Sivasundaram, excuse me, Sujit, at University of Cambridge, who is in many ways leading this turn more broadly, Associate Professor Takehiro Watanabe at Sophia University, and Professor Nadin Neé of Osaka University. I'll spare you the summaries of this group's remarkable CVs and simply post to the chat the link that the exceptional staff at ARI has put together so that you can peruse their CVs and biographies. I want to underline as I send that link, and you'll find it there in the chat, the remarkable collection of talent that we're seeing in this group. We have senior scholars in Japan studies, in oceanic history, and other areas of the academy. We have early and mid-career scholars who are setting the pace for the best. Dare I say, in this surging field of oceanic history, the water puns are too many to ignore in this case. It's a really remarkable group, and the work is great fun. I also want to note something, the obvious for those of us who are involved in this project. We are none of us here by accident. We may be scattered across the globe, but it is NUS and ARI that's brought us together. And this conference or this panel very much feels like we've come full circle. We're here thanks to the generous sponsorship of the Asia Research Institute, which hosted some of us in this group in the year before the pandemic, what my students call the before times, for a remarkable and productive conference on oceanic history as it related to Japan. That convening act initiated a series of workshops that took us to Berlin, brought us here to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and has included contributions at a variety of conferences worldwide, in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere, certainly across Asia. So it's all because of the convening of ARI that we're here in the first place. All of that work has come together in a manuscript that we are calling Oceanic Japan, which is co-edited by Professor Hay, Dr. Huebner, William Tsutsui, and myself, which will be published by University of Hawaii Press, and which each of the authors here are contributors to, either offering a research paper, or in the case of Sujit, a framing essay meant to pose a set of questions that define a particular approach to this burgeoning field of oceanic history, a means of engaging through method and new thinking with the questions that are at the center of Oceanic Japan. In its simplest terms, the volume seeks to do three things. It asserts unequivocally that something that should be obvious, which has been oddly absent in the Japan studies field until quite recently, and in Northeast Asian studies more broadly. We cannot understand Japan without thinking about oceanic spaces, ecologies, and the cultures that define the archipelago. Second, the editors want to make a strong claim for the agency of the ocean, the capacity of watery, wavy, and generally soggy places to actively shape as well as confine and define the course of events. Oceans make history. They are not simply stages, they are not empty events. They are not points of connection, although they do matter very much in making connections, as well as dividing nation states and actors. Third, the volume seeks to place Oceanic Japan adjacent to, not within, the encompassing field of environmental history, arguing that, of course, oceans are environments and ecologies, but that understanding these historical ecologies demands specific tools and modes of analysis that ask us to deterritorialize our thinking, deterrestrialize our thinking, to move offshore and look again through new eyes and with new methods. We're lucky enough today to have a series of papers that begin to explore those dimensions, take us to new places, ask us to look with new eyes. We're going to learn about cows, we're going to learn about salmon, we're going to learn about aliens from other places. It's a fascinating group of papers. Our format today is admirably nimble. Each of our authors is going to offer about 5 to 7 minutes of kind of presentation and thinking, a kind of snapshot intervention, drawing out original research and thinking. We're going to talk about early modern castaways, late modern oil platforms, Hawaiian fishing fleets, and the flavor of rivers, or what David Armitage, who is another leader in this field, and others in the field have come to talk about as terraqueous histories, those that blend the land and the sea, without losing track of the fecund differences between each and amongst them both. We're also going to talk about the master species of the Japanese table internationally, tuna, and the creatures who consume them. Each of the speakers will follow in succession. There will be time for questions following the presentation. So I'd urge everyone here to note your questions and please add them to the chat. That's part of why I posted the link there. It's signaled for you that the chat is active. As you have questions, as they come to mind, by all means, include them in the chat. There will be ample opportunity for our discussion following the presentations, and we don't want to lose track of your thinking or interventions. Finally, last but not least, before we begin with David Howell, I want to pause again to thank Professor Bunnell, the director of the Asia Research Institute, to thank the members of the Institute, to thank the remarkable staff who pulls off these complicated events with seeming ease. And we know how difficult this is in the context of COVID. Thank you for making it so easy and productive for all of us. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience for being here. Thank you for joining us all. We'll begin with Professor David Howell.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you all today. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to turn off my video because I don't trust my internet connection. I've subtitled my presentation, 3 Anecdotes on the Way to a New Perspective on Early Modern Japan in the Pacific. Before I launch into the stories, let me remind you, as Ian said, that my full paper, along with the others of the other presenters, is included in the forthcoming Oceanic Japan volume. So, anecdote number 1. In 1825, the writer Kyokte Bakin wrote a short account of a mysterious vessel, an utsuro bune, or hollow boat, that washed up at a village on the Pacific coast of Japan in 1803. The boat carried a single passenger, a young woman. You can see the woman and her boat on the slide. The villagers could not communicate with her, but they decided that she must have been a princess exiled by her father for having an illicit love affair. They speculated that the wooden box she clung to held the severed head of her lover. They did not know where she had come from, but they supposed she was probably from Russia, or perhaps Bengal, or even America. After a few days, the villagers sent her away, and so she disappeared, her fate unknown. Bakin's story is fiction, but at the very least, a similar account was in circulation in 1815. So there is a kernel of folklore, or who knows, maybe some kind of actual incident behind it. Nowadays, the story of the flying saucer-like hollow boat is offered as proof of an alien visitation to 19th century Japan, and in a way that is not too far from the purpose it held in 1825. At the time, Japan was mostly closed to formal contact with the world beyond East Asia, and what intercourse there was occurred across the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, not the Pacific. Indeed, at the time, the Japanese did not even conceive a single vast body of water. Yet the ocean was not quite outer space. By 1825, there had been many sightings of British whaling vessels off the coast where the hollow boat had supposedly landed, and a steady trickle of other ships from Russia, Britain, and the United States had approached the country. The hollow boat story fits into a narrative of something's out there, but we're not quite sure what. Anecdote number 2. This anecdote is about a real-life Robinson Crusoe named Nomura Chohei. He was shipwrecked in 1785 when his cargo vessel was caught in a storm and carried off on the Kuroshio Current, or Japan Current. Chohei and 3 companions landed safely on Torishima, a small volcanic island south of modern-day Tokyo. Within 2 years, the others had died, leaving Chohei by himself. For the next 3 years, he survived alone, living largely on the raw flesh and eggs of albatrosses, until the crew of another shipwrecked vessel joined him in 1788. In 1790, yet another crew landed on the treeless island as well. After several years of not seeing any sign of passing vessels, the men decided to build their own boat and try their luck at sea. It took them almost 5 years to construct a seaworthy craft out of wood and scrap metal salvaged from shipwrecked vessels and flotsam. Finally, in the summer of 1797, the 14 surviving men set out and, after a few days at sea, made their way to Aogashima, a small inhabited island about 225 kilometers to the north. Chohei returned to his home village just in time to crash the memorial service for the 13th anniversary of his presumed death. Nicknamed Mujinto Chohei, Desert Island Chohei, he made a living on the lecture circuit, telling the tale of his long adventure. There's Torishima. Anecdote number 3. Nakahama Manjiro, also known as John Manjiro or John Mung, returned to Japan in 1851 from a decade spent mostly serving on American whaling vessels. Manjiro and 4 companions were shipwrecked on Torishima in 1841, 4+ decades after Chohei's escape from the same island. They were rescued by an American whaler and taken to Honolulu, where Manjiro's companions remained while the young man continued on to Massachusetts and his future career as a whaler. Manjiro and his companions spent 143 days marooned on Torishima before being rescued. No doubt they were lucky to have been saved at all, but the heavy traffic of Western whaling vessels in the North Pacific facilitated their rescue. Western whalers did not begin to hunt in the waters near Japan until the 1820s, by which time their success in killing so many southern whales forced them to look to the North Pacific for new populations to exploit. That is why Chohei languished on Torishima for years without seeing any ships, and Manjiro was rescued after about 20 weeks. A new perspective. A conventional and certainly not unreasonable way to make sense of these anecdotes would be to relegate the first 2, the hollow boat and the Japanese Robinson Crusoe, to the realm of the prehistory of Japan's engagement with the Pacific, and begin the narrative with a charismatic castaway like John Manjiro, who in his career after repatriation contributed importantly to Japan's engagement with the Pacific as a site of economic and geopolitical importance. And sure enough, Manjiro is famous, as are a handful of others with similar stories, while my other subjects have been mostly forgotten. From an early modernist perspective, a conventional and certainly not unreasonable approach would be to focus entirely on the hollow boat as evidence of just how alien the Pacific was to Japanese people at the time. A surprising thought considering that the country is, after all, an archipelago in the Pacific. But perhaps not so surprising after all, given that the only direction worth looking toward was the West, where the treasures of China, Korea, and Southeast Asia lay. The problem with these conventional and certainly not unreasonable approaches is that they serve to reinforce ingrained ideas about Japan as isolated from or engaged with the outside world. The ocean is a plot device in the narrative of shutting Japan off from most contacts with the West on the one hand, or in getting a few prescient manjiros to North America where they could see firsthand Japan's modern destiny on the other. In any case, there are actually countless stories of mysterious vessels and castaways landing in Japan, and Japanese castaways ending up on the Asian mainland, Southeast Asia, and even North America during the early modern period. An oceanic perspective on early modern Japanese history would write these stories into a narrative set on the ocean, with the ocean as agent rather than prop, giving equal weight to those stories that eschew teleology as to those that connect somehow to Japan's eventual opening up to trade and diplomacy with the Western world. Thank you.
Stefan Huebner will offer our next presentation. Thank you, Stefan.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I will share my screen now. So thanks again to Tim, Ian, the events team, and all of you for being here. So when we think about the Japanese archipelago, we usually imagine islands of various sizes inhabited by humans and other species. However, during the second half of the 20th century, offshore oil and gas drilling platforms contributed to the growth of another artificial archipelago, this platform archipelago, as I will call it here. Like other Japanese islands, created an amphibious space in which terrestrial and marine habitats interacted with each other. Okay, on its dry parts above the water, it created a new habitat for humans, engaged in exploring and exploiting offshore oil and gas fields located below the seabed. Simultaneously, on its submerged parts, the platform archipelago provided a new reef-like underwater habitat full of marine species naturally occurring around the islands, and potentially also alien species, even though this is not the kind of alien species that we were talking about in the first presentation. Ships were designed to move at high speed between ports. Platforms, in contrast, usually were towed at low speed and were built to remain stationary for long periods of time. The result was the growth of complex, self-sustaining ecosystems of marine bacteria and fungi, algae, barnacles, sponges, tube worms, moss animals, mussels, corals, oysters, crabs, sea stars, various fish, and other species. In my talk, I want to discuss why and how this platform archipelago enabled technologically advanced adaptation to unstable aquatic spaces, and the consequences for humans and marine species. The question of adaptation is important because as of 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other expert groups consider mitigation of climate change and rising sea levels no longer fully possible. Instead, they focus on a combination of mitigation and adaptation. So to begin with the provocative part of my talk and my first point, many of the present critical academic claims of never before seen global scale technological helplessness and imminent disaster because of climate change and rising sea levels need to be understood in the framework of preceding state-driven terrestrialization processes that were based on land reclamation and a corresponding global mindset in which water represents an element of fear and disaster. In scholarly publications in the humanities, including Asian and Japanese studies, adaptation and an amphibious perspective are regularly either overlooked or at best superficially covered. During the 20th century, the imagery of modernization and development meant that Japanese and other government officials increasingly associated amphibious architecture with pre-modern, low-tech solutions. In contrast, technologies of terrestrialization, like large hydroelectric dams, flood walls, dikes, and pumping stations, enabled large-scale land reclamation processes by removing floodplains and preventing perennial river and coastal floods. They promised a terrestrial form of state-led irrigation, urbanization, and industrialization at home and in colonial empires, including the Japanese Empire. After World War II, leading Japanese STEM experts continued their careers abroad. I therefore argue that the 20th century, and its second half in particular, marked a moment when large parts of the world, including Japan, had shifted to a normative understanding of human habitats that centered on technologies of terrestrialization. However, the situation changes if this dominant mindset is left and the focus is shifted from technologies of water control and removal to technologies of adaptation and vulnerability reduction, which can also count Japan's waters among its birthplaces. In the late 1950s, oil platform construction turned into a new business model for Japanese companies, similar to Singapore during the late 1960s. So some of the things that I say can also be applied to Singapore. Such platforms constituted amphibious alternatives to technologies of terrestrialization. In the same sense, large-scale proposals for the urbanization of Tokyo Bay, such as star architect Tange Kenzo's from 1961 and US designer R. Buckminster Fuller's from 1966, which are depicted here, can be seen as counter-proposals to large hydroelectric dams, since they propose the human habitat elevated above or floating on the bay surface, instead of using technologies of terrestrialization for a land reclamation process. During the following decades, and through much smaller designs, floating and elevated structures proposed or adaptation to unstable aquatic spaces. After all, Japan's coastlines remained prone to tsunami, which caused the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. Architect Kikutake Kiyonori afterwards stated his opinion that his floating designs would have reduced vulnerability and withstood the disaster, which contributed to a global debate about floating nuclear power plants. This global dimension of the adaptation topic was again discussed in April 2019 at the United Nations Roundtable on Sustainable Floating Cities, so to speak. Moreover, floating high-tech homes and numerous other platformic structures like floating solar panels and offshore wind turbines followed the same idea of adaptation to climate change and sea level rise affected, flood-prone, and generally unstable aquatic spaces. My second shorter point is that the adaptation process of marine species in certain cases turned too successful. I do not want to turn human adaptation strategies into a complete success story, since they also result in potentially unharmonious multi-species assemblages. After all, many human stakeholders did not appreciate potentially invasive alien marine species moving together with platforms. The platform archipelago, comprising platforms constructed in Japanese waters, platforms being towed to Japan for maintenance purposes, and a few platforms drilling oil and gas in Japanese waters, created a new marine geography that enabled marine species to spread between platforms, ships, and the rapidly expanding number of coastal structures with hard surfaces made from steel or concrete. In that sense, what happened here is reminiscent of the so-called shipworm epidemic or bioinvasion in US and other waters between the 1860s and 1940s, which was the result of a rapid expansion of wooden coastal structures like wharfs or oil derrick hosting piers of the early offshore oil industry, in combination with increasing ship traffic of wooden ships. One example for transoceanic journey are the bay barnacles, who due to favorable habitat conditions on the steel jacket of platform Maui A, survived the documented translocation in 1975 from Japan to New Zealand's waters. They did not establish themselves, most likely being removed during an inspection upon the jacket's arrival. But due to shifting perspectives in environmental and bioinvasion management, bay barnacles eventually played a prominent role in New Zealand's risk analysis in 2011. On the other side of the Tasman Sea, the Australian government in 2016 classified the bay barnacles as an invasive alien species of extreme risk. Altogether, the platform archipelago made an inspirational contribution to the construction of floating or elevated high-tech structures, including homes, demonstrating individual and collective human agency in adapting to a transforming world. The related vulnerability reduction for certain marine species who became more able to survive transoceanic journeys, nevertheless was actually too successful, I argue, in the view of many human stakeholders from Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, very much. We'll be joined next by Professor Manako Ogawa. Welcome, Manako.
Thank you very much. Let me share my PowerPoint. Thank you very much for introducing me. I'm Manako, and I'm a scholar of American studies, and I have studied the history of Japanese immigration in Hawaii, in particular, the Japanese contribution to the fishing industry in Hawaii. So today I will talk about the collaboration and confrontation of among those of the Japanese fishing industry, international non-governmental organizations or NGOs, the territorial government of Hawaii, and White House in Washington, D.C. over the development of the fishing industry in Hawaii during the first half of the 20th century. Okay, when the first Japanese group came to Hawaii in 1885 as government contract laborers at sugarcane plantations, some of them chose fishing as a profession. Within a couple of decades, the Japanese fisher folk and Japanese-style fishing boat, or sampan, came to dominate local fishing operations. By the 1920s, the fishing industry had grown into the third largest sector of Hawaiian economy, behind the sugarcane and pineapple industries. With the expansion of the fish-eating population, in particular the Japanese and other Asian immigrants, local politicians moved to protect the Japanese fishing business and increase the food self-sufficiency rate in Hawaii. Hawaii also had another favorable wind to facilitate collaboration with the Japanese. Since the 1910s, Hawaii had a rise of internationalist movements inspired by the establishment of the League of Nations after the devastation of World War I. Alexander Hume Ford in Honolulu established the Pan-Pacific Union in 1917. With a strong self-consciousness of Hawaii as a crossroad of the Pacific, the Pan-Pacific Union hosted international conferences on a variety of topics attended by many specialists from Asian and Pacific nations, including Japan. By using his personal connections with Japanese leaders, Ford urged Territorial Governor Lawrence Judd to invite Mikimoto Kokichi, a pioneer of the cultural pearl industry in Japan. Because pearl oyster reefs were discovered in Hawaii in the 1920s, Hawaii needed technical assistance from Mikimoto for the purpose of establishing its own cultural pearl industry. However, Mikimoto turned down the offer to start his business in Hawaii because a new adventure in Hawaii seemed not profitable. But such Hawaii-Japan collaboration shows that the local political and economic leaders of Hawaii took a favorable stance toward Japan to stimulate the local fishing industry. Such a positive attitude toward Japan was not widely shared in Washington. In particular, President Franklin Roosevelt and the US military were eager to suppress the Japanese at sea. The US military suggested that Governor Joseph Poindexter of Hawaii prohibit fishing by Japanese aliens because they would conduct espionage for Japan in case of war. Governor Poindexter disagreed. He wrote a letter to President Roosevelt that the exclusion of the Japanese fishermen would jeopardize the territorial economy. But the Roosevelt administration set up a new regulation requiring that only American citizens could own a boat of 5 gross tons or more and engage in commercial fishing as captains. Complying with this rule, US customs officials seized 19 Japanese sampan boats in February 1941. After fierce lobbying by local political and business leaders in Hawaii, all the sampan boats were released by October 1945. When Japanese naval airplanes started bombing Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in the early morning of December 7th, 1941, Some of the Japanese fishermen were operating off the coast of Oahu, and they lost their lives due to attacks from US airplanes. Many other fishermen were sent to internment camps in Hawaiian chain and the mainland US. A few hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, Governor Poindexter placed the entire territory under martial law. The military government prohibited people of Japanese ancestry from conducting fishing activities because their presence at sea was deemed a threat to national security. But the territorial government and local politicians repeatedly demanded normalization of the sea and often confronted the military. The political maneuvering over the liberation of Hawaiian waters ended on July 10, 1945, when the US Navy lifted almost all of the restrictions. Japanese fisherfolk were finally licensed to go fishing with their ID cards, although they are not permitted to operate as captains until the end of the war. Here's what the conclusion is. The political and business leaders of Hawaii constantly supported the Japanese fishing operation to feed the local population. In addition, Hawaii-centered international NGOs stimulated personnel and information exchanges between Hawaii and Japan. As I mean in my brief presentation, the disagreements between Hawaii and Washington strongly reflect the tremendous changes in the political and economic environments of the Pacific during the first half of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manako. Next, we'll be joined by Professor Sujit Sivasundaram from University of Cambridge. Welcome, Sujit.
Thank you very much. It's a really great pleasure to join Ari for this anniversary roundtable. And thank you, Tim, Ian, and Stefan for the welcome, for chairing, and for the invitation. So I have visited Ari before, and I seem to remember the last time I was at Ari in person, I had recently published a book on Sri Lanka called Islanded. And this time, as I speak, I've actually sort of ventured more broadly into oceanic history in the same period of the late 18th and the early 19th centuries, which was the period I looked at in Islanded. So what I wish to do today is to consider Japan and oceanic history from the perspective of my earlier work on Sri Lanka, and as a Sri Lankanist working on the wider Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, though not directly on Japan. So the first thing to say, of course, is that both Sri Lanka and Japan are islands at the boundaries of Asia. For me, and this is a point that I made in my earlier work, islands are critical to Asian and world history. They have been laboratories for experiments of state-making, for reform, for science, for programs of modernity. So Asian studies, of course, can very easily fall into an excessive focus on mainlands. But in the case of Sri Lanka, this has involved this sort of island status and the critical status of it as an island, the participation of multiple invaders who took the island because it was an island and so useful for programs of wider annexation. And also, as I have argued, in the British moment, they could make it an island and make it an island intellectually, culturally, environmentally, and governmentally as well. The position of islands in the ocean, in turn, has meant that they have served as jumping off points, in the case of Sri Lanka, for Buddhist monks or Muslim merchants, or indeed for plantation systems or for pearl fishers. If so, what does islanding mean for the Japanese case? Indeed, new work shows, and some of it is represented here, that Japan also sought to place itself as an archipelago in the Pacific, and that it too was a string of islands which stood for empire and nation in turn as we go into the period covered in some of the talks. In other words, an island-centric method works differently, but can yield useful results at both these ends of Asia. But thinking with Sri Lanka in order to come to Japan is not only about comparison, but there are deep connections between these two islands in the making of the 19th and 20th century. So in growing up in Sri Lanka, one distinct story I recall is the tale of how Japan was exporting human eyes from the island. I've now done some research because I kind of worried that this is the kind of story that a child might dwell on too obsessively. But in fact, Japan is one of the largest exporters of human cornea from Sri Lanka, extracted from dead bodies for transplants in living people. A former president of Sri Lanka, J.R. Jayawardena's cornea was divided into two and implanted into two Japanese patients. He died in 1996. So there's this Buddhist belief that there's a great deal of merit to be gained by gifting eyes, and this sits within the close Japanese connections with Sri Lanka's eye bank. Giving eyes and keeping them biologically stable over vast distances is a story of science and technology acting over distance. Indeed, in Sri Lanka, Japan has, since the 19th century, and this is a sort of prehistory of this, represented a technologically advanced Buddhist state. And it is for this reason that pan-Buddhist sensibilities, as much as science and technology, or indeed ideas of merit, tie these islands together. Some significant aspects of this wider story include the important Sri Lankan Buddhist revivalist Anagarika Dharmapala's engagement with Japan, including an interest in Nichirenism. He visited Japan in 1893, 1889, 1902, and 1913. Thinking with oceans, meanwhile, this relationship of these two island societies is also about ships and geopolitics. In September 2020, in the midst of our pandemic, the Japanese warships Kaga and Ika-Azuchi visited the port of Colombo. One press release noted, as maritime nations with time-honored friendship, Sri Lanka and Japan have been working closely to promote peace, stability, and prosperity for the Indian Ocean, in the heart of which Sri Lanka is located. Japan then is committed to a free Indian Ocean, which, by the way, is a direct critique of Chinese strategy in investing in ports such as Colombo and Hambantota, and in the south of Sri Lanka as well. And this sort of whole debate about China and Japan and port building alongside India's involvement as well carries on and rumbles on with a lot of controversy to the present time as Chinese efforts with $15 billion project in Colombo are proceeding apace. Now, I'm not a specialist on Japan's relations with Sri Lanka, but the point I make here is that distant islands, in addition to sharing comparative histories in the modern world, need connections with each other to sustain their places in the midst of politics directed from land masses. This is why Pan-Buddhism or Pan-Asianism was significant to the relation between Sri Lanka and Japan, and also why Japan is not forgotten in this new moment of geopolitics with the rise of China in the Indian Ocean. So to conclude, Japan's ocean stretches into the Indian Ocean. It's not just a Pacific story. And I'd love to see work done by Japanese studies scholars more and more on the Indian Ocean too. And thinking comparatively and connectedly, we might bring into such an account ideas such as Buddhism and Asianism, as much as the techniques and financing of survival in a continuously modernizing and environmentally and politically changing world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sujit. Thank you for the provocation. And the prompt is a provocation for all of us to make use of the chat as considering questions for the panel. Our next speaker will be Takehiro Watanabe from Sophia University in Japan. Welcome, Tak.
Thank you, and let me share my video. Hold on a second. Okay, can you see my video, my slide rather? Oops.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to make a little slight change in my screen so I can see my own notes. Okay, good. Thank you, and then also for the ARI team for putting together this really great roundtable. So this talk titled Flavor of Rivers, Salmon Cows, and Tree Planting and Fishers in Eastern Hokkaido, Japan, is in the book that has been mentioned earlier, and the chapter chronicles how salmon fishers tried to stop the government from cutting down an ancient Ainu forest. And the Ainu are a group of people indigenous to northern Japan. And the forests were chopped down to create dairy farms because they were worried about, and these fishers are very worried about pollution of their coastal fishery ground. And although they failed to stop the government, they began to plant trees and help establish a government regulation that required the agricultural sector to construct riparian buffers, which are wooded areas along rivers. So let me briefly talk about how I came across this topic and also discuss a few themes along the way. So I heard about fishers planting trees in Hokkaido during my research on the wildlife conservation of black-stemmed fish owls, which are one of the largest owl species in the world. And these owls are threatened with extinction due to the loss of old growth riparian forests. Now, why would the disappearance of ancient forests near rivers affect the survival of this bird species? Well, you can imagine from the name that they eat fish in rivers, so and including salmonids. So that's one thing. And it also nests in the hollows of trees that are large enough to hold this very big owl. So only old trees, big trees, will do, and therefore old growth riparian forests. Now, I met some farmers and fishers who are members of a community group involved in the protection of these owls. And every year they hold these tree planting events at the head of the Nishibetsu River, which is the river that I write about, in order to restore the forest habitat for these owls. And I soon realized that there are many tree planting events in Hokkaido involving fishing communities and that their origin was very local. In the 1980s, a women's group in the fishing community located at the mouth of the river led the first Hokkaido-wide community tree planting event. And it is these women now in their 70s and 80s whom I had a chance to talk to, who use this phrase, flavor of rivers, to refer to their worry that salmon will no longer return to their local river. And since salmon is an important fish for many North Pacific communities, I decided to look a little bit deeper into this history. Now, one of the themes that I wanted to highlight was the way non-scientists like fishers and farmers use science. In Hokkaido since the 1950s, a vast mosaic of forests and wetlands was transformed into farmland, some of it with World Bank money. And what were the ecological consequences of this development? Well, the fishers knew and felt this consequence slowly in their work and their living environment, but it was only with science that their knowledge would be actionable. They had to learn about salmon forest food web ecology, hydrology of forest and farmland, how to monitor pollution of rivers and coastal waters, and so on. I was amazed, for example, at how these fishers in the 1970s took their boats down the river, documenting the pollution with an 8mm camera. I also argue in my paper that Japan's public discourse on industrial pollution, such as the famous Minamata mercury poisoning case, actually served to obfuscate the hydrological problems that these fishers faced. Also, practicing science probably required a leap of faith for these fishers and farmers who had reasons to doubt the intentions of state scientists, and especially in a region that was treated as a quasi-colonial backwater. So I wanted to explore the performative and political dimensions of how this fishing community practiced science. Another theme that I wanted to foreground was the way that land governance and ocean governance are linked in a direct physical way by salmon and rivers. Many accounts of the modern era present a well-worn narrative of imperial powers grabbing land and ocean, at the same time extending land-based institutional arrangements to the sea, right? So the movement here is from the land to the sea. But I wanted to suggest a more meandering storyline. A part of my argument is that the fishery industry looked landward due to Japan's acceptance of fishing agreements in the North Pacific, and that was a major factor in the institutionalization of riparian buffers in Hokkaido. Before the 1980s, coastal waters were just parking lots for their long-distance fleets, but when they no longer could fish in the high seas, these parking lots became an important fishery ground for the community's economic survival, and the fishers became concerned about their environmental conditions. And because these coastal waters are affected by rivers and the water upstream, the change also had implications for land use governance, rivers, wetlands, forests, mountains, farms, and ultimately cities. So here, salmon and rivers are key because they connect land and ocean. Right? Salmon travel and grow in the ocean and then return to their birth rivers inland to spawn and die. And in this process, the salmon bring ocean nutrients inland and nurture forests. So the term salmon forest, for example, has now become a popular term, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Salmon have played a part in shaping territorial claims in the North Pacific. Right? Many historians, I'm an anthropologist, by the way, but many historians have helped me to understand that the role of fishery industry in Japan's military expansion was very important. And agreements and laws concerning salmon fishing in the Pacific have evolved over time. And there was general effort to stop Japanese fishers from catching salmon in the high seas. But in the 1990s, Japan finally complied with the salmon ban. And it is said that Japan now supports this ban in order to protect their own hatchery salmon from foreign fleets. Right? Such protection is given by this UNCLOS article that says states in whose rivers anadromous stocks originate shall have the primary interest in and responsibility for such stocks. So the phrase flavor of rivers that I use in the title is not only about river pollution. The phrase also echoes the economic and political interests of Japan's fishery industry in the high seas. The fishers are claiming a kind of ownership over the hatchery salmon, the salmon that are going in swimming in the Pacific, and they become a kind of hybrid avatar of Japanese capital, of science, of nature, and state-directed fishery management. I'll end it here because I think I'm at 9 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Tak, and what a wonderful slide to end on. Our next speaker will be Professor Nadin Neé from Osaka University. Welcome, Nadin.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here tonight and also for the invitation. So my connection is not very stable. So the RI team agreed to show my slides, and I will turn off my video while I'm talking. So I did actually choose to reflect a bit more broadly on oceanic issues and not concentrate on my chapter contribution to the volume we are editing. So first slide, please. In the piece of art, you can see here how Hong is playing with common patterns of mapping the world. Where usually continents, territories are the center of attraction, we see oceans. This corresponds to what Elisabeth Mann-Borghese claimed, I quote, "The oceans are a great laboratory for the making of a new world order," unquote. She was among those that helped establish the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, which was enacted in 1982. The international resolution established that zones of 200 nautical miles, so-called exclusive economic zones, could be subsumed under national jurisdiction by coastal states, with the latter having the sole right to exploit the zone's resources. And we already heard a little bit about this in Tak's talk. This process has been identified as a change in the historical quality of ocean space. And next slide, please. Today, I will reflect a bit on oceanic space and time based on my work on tuna. Oceans of ink have been spent on how to narrate, label, and periodize so-called modern history. I argue that the territorialization of the ocean was one of the most crucial turning points in the 20th century. In terms of scale, it is the most planetary remapping of the globe in this period in the 20th century and maybe even beyond, something we could discuss, including an oceanic view. When we think about territory and territorialization, helps us deepen the analytical value of it by considering verticality more consequently. The idea of including more and more sea mammals into the territory of states led to a scramble of the oceans and imaginations of what has been named by some volumetric sovereignty. Fish and fishing regimes played a crucial role in this process. Territorialization of the sea was at the same time pushed and undermined by a fisheries regime and a fish regime. What do I mean by that? Fisheries always have been about more than just about fish, part and parcel of attempts to gain volumetric sovereignty by territorializing the sea, aimed at capitalizing its resources, as both the surface and the vertical dimension were linked to geopolitical considerations. The competition for access to fish, on one hand, led to the creation of new fisheries management systems through technocratic solutions and the law of the sea as a new legal framework. On the other hand, these new regimes were simultaneously undermined and reformed by the fish they hunted and the ecologies they lived in. Territorialization was in that sense both determined and undermined by an ecological regime. So we can define regime both as a form of human being statehood and what has been used for ecological regimes within the natural sciences. Due to its particularly rich fishing grounds regionally, next slide, please. We just keep it this. Due to its particularly rich fishing grounds regionally, the Indo-Pacific became one of the largest fishing grounds in the world. The race over marine resources in this region increasingly involved resource nationalism among newly emerging Pacific island states who claimed their national right over marine resources in their coastal waters. Both the United States and the Soviet Union competed with Japan for fishing rights and access to the newly emerging nation states' EEZ's fishing grounds. What you can see here is that a specifically regional geography was the base of an international scramble for oceanic resources. And I think perhaps along the line, or also slightly different than Sujit did put it, that Asian studies as a field can contribute in reconsidering specific regional oceanic geographies. So for me particularly, what I would call the Indo-Pacific and as well the South Pacific would be very important. But I will come to my next thoughts, namely the question, how does this relate to the issue of time? Marine resource enclosure and extraction regimes can be placed within the transformation that has been called the Great Acceleration, and thereby could be seen as an anthropogenic phenomenon. On the one hand, particular human environmental or bodily knowledge was indispensable in this process. On the other, capital-intensive high-tech fishing and cooling methods, as well as transportation, changed patterns of labor on the sea when harvesting fish, as well as its commodification. It not only had a profound impact on the life cycles of the fish and oceanic ecologies, but equally impacted human lives. Capitalist social relations deeply transformed oceanic ecologies, being coupled with human migration in the 20th century. In this sense, I think it is not productive to see the form of oceanic resource attraction as just another indices of the Anthropocene. Similarly, I shy away from simply depicting the territorialization of the sea and its accompanying oceanic regime as a form of the Capitalocene. What Asian studies can offer in this regard is to scale down and show that although capitalist time structured extraction of marine common goods and the sea's mapping, it was still influenced by oceanic times and temporalities. Certainly, capitalist fisheries work through the sea in particular grounds where fish are present, and with its modes of production, it undermines the environmental conditions for its own reproduction. The drive to create profit has undermined both marine species populations as well as various artisanal modes of fisheries. In the meantime, even though fishers are forced to work on capitalist clock time, this regime is undermined by the oceanic creatures and oceanic time. The life cycles and movements of migratory species have their own rhythm connected to the movement of currents, monsoons, and interaction with changing climate. This is reminiscent, of course, of Bunnell's conceptualization of various times, the geographic one, for instance. Time defined as time as measured by human clocks is what fishers had to stick to in the capitalist and industrial mode of fisheries on the vessels. Fish fluctuate, and when they approach a vessel, the team has to labor in the most capitalist way. But fishers are at the mercy of the fish in terms of timing. They cannot overcome the unpredictability of oceanic time and temporalities of the fish and its movements, steered by wind, currents, and much more, undermining the capitalist one. In that process of extraction, the time of marine species does not necessarily follow the narrative of progress or acceleration, as it also fluctuates not simply for anthropogenic reasons, but for climate change, winds, currents, changing for reasons unknown to humans and not only in the area that is now named the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadin. And thank you to all of our speakers. Please join me, everyone, here with some snaps for our presenters. I look forward to providing snaps and applause and hopefully a voice to each of us gathered here via the chat for questions. So as I offer some brief kind of framing responses intended mainly to prompt discussion, I hope that those of us gathered here will offer questions and comments in the chat, which I'll then help to moderate. What a great collection of papers, and just a kind of tasting menu for a broad work that is gathered together in Oceanic Japan. I've had a number of chats privately from folks asking about the publication of the volume. We anticipate, hope, and plan that it will be in either in 2022 with a publication date, University of Hawaii Press. This work reminds us that the ocean is everywhere in Japan. Everywhere and nowhere. The term alien came up, alienating, aliens, difference in the first three papers consistently. I'm flummoxed to think of a developed nation whose culture, economy, and environment are so fully defined by the seas, and which has also, in certain key ways, not always, turned its back so fully on the oceans. Oceans are first and foremost, Nadin's paper in particular notes for us, but each of the papers, the last three in particular, note for us workscapes in Japan. Sites of labor, sources of food and raw materials, as well as what I've come to think about as the great sink of the nation state, the dumping site for vast quantities of refuse, chemicals, and detritus. The poison effluents that spewing from the Chiso factory that in Minamata, which Tak mentioned. But the country always seems in certain ways to be turning back to the ocean, to be returning to it. The problem is widely recognized. It's not just historians and anthropologists and sociologists recognizing these problems. When the 2020 Olympics were claimed by Tokyo, one of the myriad justifications for the extravaganza of tax-fueled spending funneled through highly capitalized, state-sponsored and adjacent construction companies was that Tokyo, the capital of the nation, would rediscover the ocean. Event spaces were erected on the man-made islands that line the edges of Tokyo Bay. Tours were envisioned. Delicious edomae sushi was promised. It was just the latest iteration in a very old story, as David's paper reminds us. Tokyo and Japan have been turning to the oceans, not just for decades, but for centuries. How do we account for this returning, this constant effort to return? The causes are many, but it may be perhaps the ubiquitous, daunting presence of the ocean, and that it confounds efforts to encapsulate its complexity and centrality. And in this connection, Nadin's paper prompts me to think carefully about the resonance and relationships between climate thinking and oceanic thinking, which raises for us questions of scale and the human place in those questions of scale. The turn to the ocean is always happening and seemingly always has been in the archipelago. It has always been in the process of becoming. Becoming, as Sujit's paper and others remind us, is often a violent process. Take, for example, Marine Memorial Day or Umi no Kinembi or Ocean Day, a national holiday. It seems pretty innocuous, right? Meant to give thanks for the ocean's bounty and to recognize the importance of the sea to Japan as a maritime nation. What could be more innocuous? Well, the reality of Umi no Kinembi, of course, and this is well known, is that it was created in 1941 at the very height, the pinnacle, the peak of imperial expansion, oceanic expansion, on the cusp of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the advent of the Pacific War. It was created to commemorate the Meiji Emperor and his 1876 voyage on the Meiji Maru, an iron sailing ship built for the Japanese government in 1873 by Robert Napier and Sons, shipbuilders of Glasgow, Scotland. You can still visit the Meiji Maru on the campus of the Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology, by the way. And let me just urge everyone, when the world comes back together, to make that trip. It's wonderful. You will be, I promise you, the only one gazing upon its iron sides, but it is nonetheless an important marker of change and continuity over time. It ties together the becoming of violence, empire, warfare, development, capitalism. Umi no Kinembi was, in fact, a celebration of empire then. It was meant to underline the sense of Japan as an ocean empire, Kaio Taikoku, a great oceanic power, and an oceanic nation, Kaikoku Nippon. The nomenclature is ubiquitous everywhere. In more recent times, Umi no Kinembi has become more of an excuse to take a day off during Japan's hot summers, when national holidays are relatively few, or have been until the 1990s. Falling in July, the holiday is a day of rest for most people, frankly, in air-conditioned climates far from the sea. And for some, but far fewer, perhaps a trip to the beach, or in an activity near and dear to my academic heart, a visit to one of the nation's 20 or so large tank aquariums, a kind of pilgrimage to a man-made ocean. The date for Ocean Day is usually July 20th, observed on the third Monday of the month in order to provide rest and solace, a 3-day weekend. But in 2020, as part of a special arrangement to recognize the arrival of the world's Olympians and the ongoing Japanese rediscovery of the sea, it was moved to July 23rd. Virus and other dynamics intervened. It remained that way, that special continuity, for one more year, staying on the 23rd, while the Olympians arrived in 2021. Now, the papers here encapsulate for me the promise of that becoming, the constant effort to comprehend the nature of a relationship whose scale is equal to or in excess of more formally and broadly recognized processes, nation building, development. The scale of the engagement with the oceans dwarfs many of the dynamics that we have taken far more seriously over the course and history of our engagement. Now, I can raise a set of questions around area studies and its edges. I'd be very happy to return to that question in the discussion if we wish. The redefinition of the human relationship with the seas and the implications of area studies flagged here. But what I want to do as a prompt to discussion for our presenters first is to provide some broad prompts. And I'm going to close with the most important one, I think. The kind of broad prompts are all about thinking differently, about becoming for ourselves. So the first is how do we think differently about time? A number of you have talked about this, referenced it, but I'd like to hear more explicit engagement. Are the chronologies of our histories weighted as they are with the muddy realities of imperial history, for example, beholden to a terrestrial worldview that foregrounds the actions of terrestrial actors and nation states in particular? Is this a version of the reasonable critique of so many of our histories of Japan as fundamentally metropolitan, for example, Tokyo-centric history? More specifically, are Stefan's paper and David's paper part of the same oceanic story? Sure, they're both about the sea, but one of the points here is that the sea is hugely, massively, historically, ecologically diverse. I'm thinking here of Matsuda's work, which asks us to disaggregate the Pacific, for example. I'd like to ask, should we be aggregating or disaggregating time as we take these two papers, which may mark the poles of our chronological scope in the panel? Do you want to be together or apart is the question. The second prompt is to think differently about space. Where does Japan end and when we are attendant, in particular to the labor of fishermen and women on the vast spaces of the Taihei'o or Pacific Ocean? If the ocean is perhaps mainly a workscape for Japanese, how do we think about difference and diversification within the scope of oceanic labor? And here I'd like to be interested to hear Tak, Nadin, and Manako speak to the qualifications and analysis of labor within their paper. Nadin flags this explicitly, which I thought was really welcome. The other two discuss labor implicitly. I'd like to hear us talk about and through the question of labor as it works differently on the seas. And again, to really destabilize or decenter some of our thinking about labor within the broader historiography. And here, as a referent, for those of you who know the work of Richard White in the environmental history field, I'm making a very strongly implicit gesture to his assertions that work is our primary means of engaging with the natural world and ongoing responses to that prompt. Finally, thinking differently about oceans. And here, Sujit, whose Island is a brilliant book. And thinking differently about oceans and the role of oceans in shaping our geopolitics is the third and final prompt. How do the currents that shape our histories matter differently for these different island nations at the opposite poles of the Asian sphere? One of the great contributions of, within the volume of Oceanic Japan, I think, as an editor and not an author, comes from the work of one of our younger authors, Jonas Rueg, who's really riffing on and picking up some of the themes that Sujit has developed in Islanded and elsewhere. Jonas and others in the volume, Nadin not least, follow the gaze of their actors to look beneath the waves and to help us decipher what is happening both at the surface of the ocean and to look with differentiating eyes, disaggregating eyes, into the oceanic spaces themselves. The volume of the ocean implies depth. Historians have only recently learned to recognize it. Sujit's work, among myriad contributions, points to movement, the disaggregation of oceanic space as we look at movement over space and through time. So this is my main provocation for the group, really. So we can talk about these broader discussions and questions if we wish, but here's what I'm really asking us to do. Disagree agreeably. It was tempting for me to come into this and look for a synthetic vision for each of these papers. And indeed, that's the temptation as an editor for a volume with my fellow co-editors. But really, the opportunity of this presentation and set of presentations is for us to disaggregate our work a little bit, to think about where and why we disagree agreeably within our papers. Where do you, each of you as authors, find difference that we might think with as we think about the set of papers together? The ocean is too vast for us to simply lump these papers together as part of a single theme. In other words, I want us to bring some critique forward. We're so accustomed to beating up on area studies. Let's disagree agreeably as we make this shift to the edges of various studies. So that's my prompt for the panel. And then I'll move to look at the chat and bring other questions forward. I see a number of questions there already. I'll be quiet while I welcome some feedback from folks. David, I see you highlighted perhaps, whether that's the RE staff or not, but perhaps we could ask for responses in the order presented very briefly to the prompts and for opportunities for us to talk critically across the papers with one another.
Okay, well, I'll dive in. It's a very interesting question about aggregating or disaggregating. Time is my Pacific, the same as Stefan's Pacific, put us chronologically on opposite ends of the panel. And I'm kind of of two minds a bit about this because as somebody who works on the early modern period, I get a little bit testy if I'm just the pre-modern background to the real story, which occurs in the 20th century or beyond. But at the same time, I don't want to just say, let's completely aggregate things because there's a lot of change over time. And so in the interest of time, I'll just throw out one word that hubris. I see a kind of hubris in the projects of Stefan's actors. They're big thinkers, but they seem to think that they fundamentally understand the ocean. And of course, if you get them in conversation, I'm sure they They know a lot about what they don't know and maybe can never know about the ocean. But there's a kind of sense that I get as a listener and reader of Stefan's work that his guys think that they know what is important about the ocean. And my folks had no such hubris. They knew about the Japan current, they knew about how dangerous the ocean could be, but I think that the sense of mystery and unknowability of the ocean was really important for them.
Thank you, David. Stefan, not coincidentally, these two papers being adjacent to one another in my reading originally prompted this question. So I wonder if you want to pick this up and move ahead, and then we'll move to Manako, Sujit, Tak, and Nadin.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and also thank you, David, for giving some ideas regarding differences between the understanding of the ocean that our actors had. And I want to, I think, continue to think a bit about this topic. So when we talk about current considerations like drastic biodiversity decline, then invasive alien species are one of the major concerns, which includes marine species. And as David said, his actors maybe were not so familiar with the oceanic conditions, but I think, for example, when we talk about the hollow boat, it probably didn't only bring a princess, or what they thought to be a princess, to Japan. Most likely, when we look at the bottom of the boat, there were also all sorts of crabs, there were all sorts of barnacles and so on that may have come from Russia or from whatever waters she originally came from. So this topic here, the translocation of species, is one that actually connects the human agency, the use of technologies to bridge distances over water from David's time to the time period that I'm talking about. And when we talk about many other oceanic conditions, I think we also notice that even though they change to a certain degree over time, we have certain continuities that are very important, I think, to highlight. When we talk about currents, for example, that had an impact on how ships were moved to uninhabited islands and made them crash there and made people stay on these islands for a very long time. It's the same conditions that the offshore industry or other people had to deal with when they actually had to construct stable platforms in the ocean that would not, for example, during extreme weather events, suffer breakdowns. So I did not do this in my paper, but I argue elsewhere in the article that is coming out with Journal of Global History, probably in a couple of months, that Tim mentioned that the monsoon actually was the most important reason why the offshore industry in Asia started significantly later than the one in the United States. And one could also focus on other factors. When we talk about Japan, I think earthquakes are one of the defining elements, but at the same time, these earthquakes that continuously shape, I think, the field of Japanese studies also were one of the reasons why people in Japan already in the late 19th century were actually able to find some offshore oil fields, because the seismic activity has an impact on the seafloor. And then if it cracks and there's an oil field below, the oil comes up and you can actually see that there's oil. That's in the late 19th century, the only way how you can actually find this out. So that's also another origin story of the topic of offshore oil drilling that can be connected to other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. In the interest of time, what I'd like to ask next is to ask Manako and Tak and Nadin in particular, and Sujit, I'd like to come back to you at the end, and as an expert in the field coming from a different vantage, tell us where we are disagreeing, where we are at odds within ourselves, to the extent you may hear such things. I'd love to hear about some of the other elements too, but just to prompt that as a kind of final intervention, I'd like to ask, in the interim, Manako, Tak, and Nadin to really help us to think. Each of you discusses labor and work. Each of you does this fundamentally differently. in terms of your content, your style, and the analysis. And so I wonder if this prompts a thought from any of the three of you, Manako, Tak, and Nadin, as we look for those points of difference and dissension, or if you are so inclined to resolution, certainly that would be a welcome intervention as well. Talking about work.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter because my paper and my topic is really inland and not really about the ocean. So when asked about labor and the ocean, it's really difficult because it's always, I think, from the land's perspective. That is to say, you hear stories of, fishers going out to the high seas and, going to Russian waters and getting shot at and things like that. That's, I guess it's related to Ian's, one of Ian's prompts about how chronologies are weighted by imperialism. I mean, there's this kind of long history of conflicts with Russia that even to this day, is kind of echoing in regards to the fishers there, the fishing communities in that area. But I was thinking about also one of the things that I talked about a little bit in my paper is this idea that rivers, as the kind of maybe an extension of the watery areas of the ocean, are enclosed. They become enclosures during the modern era, and they're easy to enclose. I mean, salmon goes up the river, so it's very easy to catch them. But also, they enclose the rivers in order to prevent, say, the indigenous communities from taking the salmon from the rivers or from, poaching. And even now we have a similar situation of, say, organized crime taking salmon roe illegally to sell them, right? So there's this kind of issue of enclosure of workspace, so to say, and try to protect the hatcheries, that is to say, to protect the capital that is being produced by these technologies that is really reliant on to get to one of Stefan's points about species and maybe multi-species as well. They're really relying on the life forces of these non-human actants, and that also is something that I'm quite interested in because that's also connected to, I think, Richard White's point about the Columbia River and how it's a lot of it is about energy, not just human energy, but also energy that comes from the nutrients of these fish, for example. I'll end it here.
Thank you. Absolutely. And that points to the movement of currents as well and their differences within the historiography. Nadin and then Sujit, and as I've posted in the chat for those who are able to stay after the 30-minute mark, at which we are at this moment, we look forward to answering or prompting, offering a couple of the questions from the chat. To be transparent, they were a little late in arriving, and so we will answer them a little bit late.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I think, there are a lot of different approaches, and I see, of course, what is sort of different in terms of how we conceptualize work is that on one hand, I would say we have a, let's say, more social history or ethnical sort of approach that you would look to the practices and perhaps not so much how this work sort of is in sort of interaction with the environment per se. But I think then, on the other hand, what many papers share, and also from the discussion today, is this issue of how humans know or do not know the ocean. So I think that's a very common theme that is across almost all of the papers. And then I shortly want to get back to the question of time, in particular also as Catherine Phipps did post this question on, well, time and space in a way, and what the role of the Japanese Empire plays therein, and also the questions that were raised by Ian beforehand, so the chronology part in a way. So first of all, I think in terms of space, I would move away from depicting Japan as one island. I mean, even for conventional geography, it would be more than one island, and in that sense, also this sort of container thinking of one Japan is not particularly helpful. And when we then also think about this a bit more broadly, I think when it comes to extraction of resources out of the sea, the location really matters, and this ties back to the issue of sort of where currents come or do not meander and so forth. And this is of course related to time. So I think that's, first of all, very important. Then the imperial part. Of course, the Japanese Empire did also advance into what we would call Indo-Pacific, and this is in particular also important for my personal work, because I would argue that fisher migrants move beyond this sort of archipelago of Japan and also move to other islands, and also in the Indo-Pacific, because migratory species as tuna were be found there. So there was this emerging knowledge that they also move and migrate through that, what is called the Indo-Pacific, and not only the South Pacific, or what was sort of part of the Japanese Empire. And I think this also then connects to the time issue. When we look at labor, I mean, sure, then the question is whether we talk about capitalist labor, but even before that, I think this would be, if you sort of look at a level below, how energy is extracted, this question of energy that has been raised by Bashiba Dimos, for instance, how humans transform the environment and are transformed by the environment through work, basically, would be something where we can also see that this sort of linear process is perhaps not so important, and also move beyond the container of empire. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And Sujit, I've placed you last in many ways intentionally, because you bring vast expertise from other fields to bear. I just wanted to open the floor and invite comments, critique, and so on, and happy to bounce back as needed.
Yeah, it's been really, really fun listening to the papers. Thank you for this opportunity. I've been thinking a little bit, actually, Ian, of the point you raised about aggregation versus disaggregation. And I think in some ways it's neither, actually, that we need in thinking through these papers, because I think the logic of aggregation and disaggregation depends on a notion of the unit, right, which is defined. And really what oceanic thinking does is that it problematizes that. It problematizes notions of time and space, so that in turn, actually, aggregation and disaggregation don't mean the same thing, I would argue. You can probably aggregate as well as disaggregate at the same time. And that might be a better way to think about it, meaning that there are certainly differences between rivers and seas, and we've seen that there are differences between human-centered histories and platform-centered assemblies, and we've seen that in these papers. And so there are definitely differences, quite significant conceptual differences in the papers in relation to how environmental or geopolitical the papers have been as well in their emphases. But I think actually kind of the space of the ocean, I mean, here I use my kind of metaphor of the wave, which you had in the poster as well, is uneven. And that means that actually time and space is constantly being kind of kept in different ways, and controlling time and space on the sea is a problem, is a scientific problem. You know, you need to kind of find location. Where are you? What's happened? And so I think we need different ways. I mean, the early modern to the modern can, you know, we can work together. I was thinking about shipworms actually in listening to Stefan, which is a kind of early modern problem. So, you know, there are ways in which actually we need to think across standard periodizations, of course, and standard geographies, but not necessarily in a way that's universalizing. So disaggregate and aggregate at the same time, I would say. So there we are. There's difference in the papers, but we can also talk to each other.
And that shipworms are good to think with, which I just love. But I'm going to give voice to your question, Greta, in the interest of time. Thank you for such a rich panel. As someone working in a very different area studies field in which the maritime space is a conduit of treacherous crossing, dangerous migration, I wondered if some of the panelists could comment on economic and environmental human migration patterns. whether by sea, air, or staying past the visa limits in this region, if your work touches on that at times, how should we read migration across narrower stretches of the ocean around near Japan as a sort of adaptation, or one might interject or read it in other ways? How might such adaptations shape our understanding of the ocean and sea as a problematic space of islanding, or as a kind of agent, plot device, or prompt? Migration, and in particular, thinking about the scale of migrations, just as we might diversify oceanic histories and oceans, always plural, and therefore specific.
I'm not a Japanese historian, but I do think actually that the point that is raised about short distance migration is a really, really important one, because in oceanic history, there has been this romantic attachment to long distance connections, and certainly those are important. But I think what we have lost in the literature is really, for instance, the migrations between Sri Lanka and India, rather than right across the Indian Ocean. So I'd like to hear more from Japanese historians about what that might look like for you as well.
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little. I mean, I think it really depends, of course, on what period and etc. you look at, but I think both is important. And if you look at the period I'm working about, let's say, period when the Japanese empire did emerge, then I would say both is very important. So on one hand, you have this sort of island hopping, and people are even going to work in a nearby island. So for instance, between Okinawa and Taiwan, there were very close ties of work migration. But at the same time, of course, then you have this sort of long distance migration that are quite different. And people also move back sometimes to Japan or just not. So I think it's not that you could really sort of put all these migration together. So in that sense, very similar, I would argue.
I might add that the volume is lucky enough to include a chapter from Hannah Shepard, who's now at Yale University, looking at migration, precisely this question, Greta, as it played out in the differences and connections between peninsular Korea as colony and mainland Japan. But the mainland here, to go to Nadin's point earlier, the need to disaggregate the archipelago is really crucial. Korea mattered differently in different ways, subjectively, politically, economically, geopolitically. For those in Kyushu, one of the southern islands, for example, differently than it did for those in, to state the obvious, Hokkaido, the northern island that Taka is looking at, but also Honshu, the main island. And so again, that specificity of these particular spaces is really critical, even as we arrive in classic social scientific fashion at some shared lessons. That is, the comparison has yet to be made, I think, Sujit, between that Sri Lankan Indian space and this space. But I think there's a great deal to be learned there that would be very interesting. And a number of the private chats that have actually come to me across the course of your presentations, folks, have actually been from South Asianists asking, why do we not have a broader lens on these engagements and thinking in these comparative or connected ways? But that Korean question in particular is quite interesting. Similar but different, distinct stories could be told not just about Okinawa, but about occupied Taiwan, mainland China, Northeast China, Sakhalin, of course, and we get different stories as we begin to disaggregate the archipelago in those ways within the imperialistic space that Catherine flagged for us so nicely. Last chance for comments from David, Stefan, Manako, Tak, and then, yes, Stefan.
Yeah, I will keep this short, but regarding the question, I think one can also draw some connections between the migration of species or translocation of species and also the interrupted human migration due to quarantine islands, which maybe also has a certain relevance considering that we are in a pandemic situation. But this much more recent focus on invasion management and prevention that has a strong impact on the shipping industry, and during the last years increasingly also on the platforms of the oil industry and other industries, is, I think, in some ways similar to the interrupted connections for sailors and passengers that were the outcome of quarantine islands to check if people had become infected with contagious diseases. So these regimes of control and temporary isolation to prevent the spread of what for human stakeholders were undesirable species ranging from alien fish to bacteria, I think are something that really also tell us something about the migration patterns across the ocean. Thank you.
I would like to just say that it's clear we could continue the discussion for some time. We are working in some ways in oceanic time. Our discussion is amped up slowly and now seems to be moving with great energy. However, the staff at the Asia Research Institute are working overtime. And as someone who foregrounded labor, I want to recognize that and say thank you to the staff for their time. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to everyone for joining us here. We look forward to continuing the conversation. We're very grateful to each of you for your interventions, energy, and contributions. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tim.